Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and on this episode we're going to do a top 10. Topic of the top 10, top 10 greatest high flyers in wrestling. Now before we jump into the top 10, I'm going to explain a little bit because there probably will be a little controversy here. There's not a lot of the Lucha Libre wrestlers, mostly because I don't know a ton about Lucha Libre. I know enough to get by. And also because the inherent nature of Lucha Libre is a heavy majority of the wrestlers there are high flyers. So it's hard to differentiate the ones that really made an impact and the ones that didn't. I mean, it's obvious guys like Hurricane Ramirez created the Hurricane Rana, which is a move that everybody uses. Mondo Guerrero, guys like that. I digress. The way we determine this is a couple things. We graded people for their time frame. In other words, a high flyer in the 80s or the 90s is a lot different than the 2010s or the 2020s. And the influence they had, their overall career, their longevity. So we did take into effect someone that wrestled in 1980 would have a style that most would consider not a high flyer now. They'd be more of a mat wrestler, to be honest with you. But because we grade them in the era they were in, if they were considered a high flyer at the time, that's what they're considered for this list. If that makes sense. Influence is the main thing that we're ranking on here. With that being said, let's jump right into this. Number 10, Too Cold Scorpio. Now, Too Cold's a guy that I think doesn't quite get the respect he really deserves. He's one of the first, what I would say, heavyweight wrestlers that employed the high-flying style and used it as a majority of his offense. Yes, we've seen guys like Savage before him that would use a couple high-flying moves. But Too Cold was flipping around the ring when it wasn't expected for a guy of his size. We'd see guys like Tiger Mask before, even Brian Pillman at the same time frame would employ some of the high-flying moves. Too Cold was the first that I would consider a heavyweight that would use that style as his primary offense. Well, that's why I think he makes it on here, and I don't really think his influence... I don't think people realize how influential he really was because he did help to change the style of wrestling, help to make it accessible for bigger guys to do what he was doing. For that reason, Too Cold makes my list. Now our number 9, one of the current most influential high flyers, Ricochet. People forget Ricochet's been at this for a long time. I want to say at least 15 years now at this point. And for a long time he was kind of the quote-unquote king of the indies, king of PWG, now on WWE, on WWE's radar. He's been a guy that's taken and built on the template that was given to him. He's a guy that makes it look effortless, what he does. He's a guy that does moves that no one else in the world can do. I don't think we're really going to know Ricochet's full impact on wrestling for another 10 years at least, when we see the next crop of wrestlers that come up that have watched him on WWE, that watched him in Bola, that watched him in the Best of Super Juniors. And when you start seeing a lot of people, much like how Ricochet uses some of his influences in his matches, we're going to see Ricochet moves being used in other people's matches to continue on his influence and how innovative he really is. Because I really think, and I know, I'm not saying this is a knock, because WWE style is a little bit safer than what he was wrestling before he came there. His influence is going to be felt. There's a lot of kids that have watched Ricochet for the first time on WWE and seen the 630 and went, wow, and that's going to be something they aspire to do. For all that, Ricochet makes my list. Now our number 8, the Ultimo Dragon. Ultimo is a guy, and I know a lot of people love Ultimo. He would make this list if just for the Asai Moonsault, which is named after his real name. I mean, that's a move that almost every wrestler in the world uses now. And you can see the pieces of the Ultimo, the kicks that he would throw in. A lot of the high flyers nowadays incorporate a moveset that includes a lot of spin kicks, and Ultimo Dragon was one of the first guys to incorporate that. Him and Sean Waltman in his different iterations were the first guys that I can remember really being, quote-unquote, as they called it in the time, martial arts heavy, where they were using more kicks to set up their high-flying moves. To me, Ultimo Dragon is a guy who, again, I don't think he gets quite the respect he deserves, but I definitely think he's influential, and I definitely think he's a guy that really deserves being on this list. Now our number 7. Brother Nero, Jeff Hardy. And yes, there's a lot of you out there that'll put Jeff Hardy a lot higher than this on their list, and I can't argue that. This was one of the hardest lists I've had to make, and it's for a lot of reasons. Jeff Hardy, much like Too Cold Scorpio before, was a high flyer as a heavyweight. Now, earlier in his career, he was a little bit smaller, more fit into the junior style, but as he gained muscle mass and got bigger, he never really got out of that high flying style that he would perform. I mean, he's a guy who doesn't do swanton bombs now, who doesn't do the corner thing where they jump off of somebody into the corner. To me, Jeff has had a ton of influence. He really has. And there's a lot of wrestlers wrestling right now that will tell you that their favorite wrestler growing up was Jeff Hardy. And I really think, like I said, this was a really hard list. When I first thought of this list, I thought Hardy would be higher. But then as you see, and I'll explain as I go along with the other people, to me, and this is just me, he doesn't quite get up as high as the other people, but not as high flying, but as on the list as the other people. But I really definitely think Jeff Hardy, his biggest contribution is bringing wrestlers and influencing generations of wrestlers after him. Now, coming from that, our number 6. This is the one and only time I've put a tag team on the list, and they were definitely influenced by Jeff and his brother Matt. We're talking about Nick and Matt Jackson, the Young Bucks. Now, I know you're going to question, how can you put a team that's influenced by the Hardys above one of the Hardys? Well, Jeff Hardy, I'm sure, was influenced by Too Cold Scorpio. He was influenced by guys above him on this list. The reason I put the Young Bucks here is because, along with the teams like the Motor City Machine Guns, they really changed what tag team wrestling could be. A lot of people are detractors on their style. A lot of people love their style. Because of what they did as part of the Bullet Club, as in PWG, in New Japan Pro Wrestling, in Ring of Honor, all over the world, they were able to build their own lane and help be the guys that created All Elite Wrestling, which to me, for that involvement, that's been a change in wrestling as it is itself. Because now we have 2 viable top tier companies in America where wrestlers could go and apply their trade. With that being said, even if they didn't do that, you can already see with teams like Top Flight, teams like Private Party, there's a lot of younger teams, MSK recently, that have kind of taken the Young Bucks style and made it their own. Their influence is already being felt in wrestling, and I believe just the fact that they helped create AEW is going to continue that influence on for decades. For the next generation, you're going to hear You're going to hear kids coming up that say, I love the Young Bucks growing up. The Young Bucks are why I got into wrestling. I want to wrestle like the Young Bucks. Wrestling historians, some people don't necessarily love their style. I personally am a big fan. So for me, that's why the Young Bucks are on this list. Number 5. The whole fucking show, Mr. Monday Night, Rob Van Dam. And I could easily put Sabu on this list as well, which he probably deserved to be on here. But I picked one of the two, and don't get me wrong, I love Sabu as much as the next guy. I really think, though, with the career that Rob has had in WWE, in TNA, in ECW, again, much like Jeff Hardy, he kind of carried that high-flying style into a heavyweight division. He was one of the first heavyweight wrestlers with the high-flying style to become a prominent champion when he was the ECW television champion, which some would argue when he was the ECW champion, it was more important than their world title. So it's easy to see how his influence has changed and has made wrestling. I would even say that the Hardy Boys, if you go back and watch, and this isn't a knock on the Hardy Boys at all, if you go back and watch the Hardy Boys chronologically with what Sabu and Rob Van Dam were doing, a lot of what the Hardy Boys did, Sabu and Van Dam did first. And no knock on the Hardy Boys. I'm not saying anything negative about that. I'm just saying, to me, Rob Van Dam's influence was being felt even at the time, because you would see Rob Van Dam create a move in ECW, and then someone on Nitro or someone on Raw would do the same move a week or two later after they watched the tape of Rob Van Dam doing it. And I really think, and he was a guy that went to the highest of highs. He was the WWE champion, which at the time he was WWE champion, it was the best, the biggest, and most important thing you could be. I mean, he's been prominent role in ECW, prominent role in WWE, prominent role in TNA. There's a generation of people that grew up liking TNA more than WWE, that Rob Van Dam's their favorite wrestler. A lot of the ECW generation, Rob Van Dam's their favorite wrestler. A lot of people that watch his WWE run, he's their favorite wrestler. To me, Rob's influence is what's happening now. Guys like the Young Bucks, like a Kenny Omega even, you could see pieces of what Rob Van Dam did in their style. And that's what I think. That's why I think Rob is so high on this list, and why RVD, to me, is one of the greatest high flyers of all time. Now, coming from that, number 4, Jushin Thunder Liger. For over 35 years, Liger innovated wrestling. Whether it be the Liger Bomb, whether it be the Shooting Star Press, whether it be the Phoenix Splash, whatever you want to say, Jushin Thunder Liger is the most successful Japanese junior wrestler that I could think of, in my opinion, in the history of junior wrestling in Japan. He is an absolute legend. He's a guy that a lot of people look up to. Ricochet, you could easily see his influence on Ricochet. Will Ospreay's another guy you could see his influences on. Everybody from the generation that got to watch him. A lot of people go back and they say Pillman and Liger are some of the best matches in WCW history. I do not disagree with that. Liger's had some of the best matches in New Japan history. He's one of the guys his influence is where the juniors are in Japan now. Guys like Hiromu Takahashi, guys like Sho and Yo, everyone in that junior division is standing on the shoulders of what Jushin Thunder Liger built. And everyone that wrestles in that style, whether it be Kushida, whether it be TJP, they all have influence from Jushin Thunder Liger. It's very hard to say just how far his reach is, but I can tell you there is a very strong influence through Japanese wrestling and a very strong influence in America and probably in Mexico too. Liger, again, to me, just one of the greats of all time. He'd even make a list of greats without it being high flyers, just for all of the accomplishments he had. Now, coming from Liger, our number 3. Probably the most controversial name on this list, and I'm going to put a caveat here, much like I do with another person. The personal life and the things that he did in his personal life outside of wrestling have no bearing on this list. This is purely for his influence in the world of professional wrestling and how he shaped generations after him, and that's Jimmy Superfly Snuka. Again, I know the controversy. I know that he most likely murdered a woman, even though he was exonerated, and he never was fit to stand trial for the murder. It happened. It really did. I'm not denying that at all. And I wouldn't be mad if you said on your list you wouldn't include him. But for me, I have watched a ton of wrestling documentaries, a ton of shoot interviews. And wrestler after wrestler after wrestler has said the Superfly Splash, specifically Jimmy Superfly Snuka coming off the cage on Morocco in Madison Square Garden, is what made them want to be a wrestler. Everybody from Tommy Dreamer, Mick Foley, the Dudley Boys, a lot of the Northeast wrestlers that would go on to form what would be ECW and what would be main event talents all over the world. Not only them, there's a whole generation that tried to find that high impact flying move like Snuka had, the Superfly Splash, and they tried to emulate that. Again, if you put him in this generation, he's not going to be considered a high flyer. For what he did then, though, for how revolutionary he was then, and the influence he had, there is probably, and by the name of this list, there's probably only a handful of wrestlers that have influenced wrestling as a whole more than Jimmy Superfly Snuka. Take out the high flyer out of the equation. Maybe Ric Flair, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock. Without being one of the top tier names, Jimmy Superfly Snuka is right up there as far as influence. And people built on the backs of what he did, on his greatness, and I know, again, not a great person, but a great wrestler. Now, coming from that, our number 2, someone that's a lot less controversial, the original Tiger Mask. Much like with Snuka, much like I said with a lot of these guys, the Tiger Mask and Dynamite Kid matches influenced a generation of wrestlers. It influenced everybody that's been on this list, with sans Snuka because he came before him. Everyone on this list, either directly or indirectly, has some Tiger Mask in them. Whether it be Ricochet, whether it be Ultimo Dragon, whether it be the Young Bucks, they all have taken something from Tiger Mask's moveset and Tiger Mask's influence. He's a guy who, it can't be stated just how influential he was in his style. He was one of the real stalwarts, one of the first Japanese imports to really have a foothold in American wrestling, and just for the fact that there's still a version of Tiger Mask today, 40 years later, tells you just how important the character and the wrestler was. And again, like I said, it can't be stated just how many things were because of him. Because of Tiger Mask, we have a Jushin Liger. Because of Tiger Mask, we have Ricochet. Hence why I put him so high up on the list. Now, before we get into our number one, we do a thing here called the best of the rest. Basically, people that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it. First up, Will Ospreay. The contemporary of Ricochet, the guy that had one of the most polarizing matches in history with Ricochet. Ospreay's another guy that I don't think we've understood his full impact just yet, and how it's going to be one of those things that if I do this list in another 10 years, maybe we'll see just how influential Will Ospreay's become. He's really come into his own in the past couple of years, where he went from being one of the top juniors in Japan to one of the top wrestlers in Japan. And that's no big feat to make that transition from the juniors into the heavyweight division and be a guy that could be considered for the world championship. Ospreay's still blazing his trail, and I really think if we revisit this in 10 years, Ospreay might make the top 10, might even be one of the top 3 or 4. But for right now, he was just off of the list. Now, last but not least on our best of the rest, the Amazing Red. When I first seen the Amazing Red, I thought to myself, this is a new high flyer. This is what the style is going to be. What Red was doing in TNA in the X Division itself is the template for what basically would go on to be the PWG style and hybrided into AEW. You could say AEW is basically a card of X Division matches, and it's not without argument. To me, the guy that always stood out and always blew my mind in the X Division was the Amazing Red. The reason I didn't put him on this list is, as influential as he probably was, he was influential on a lot smaller platform than all the rest of these talents. And not knocking the guy at all. He's an amazing wrestler. For that reason, though, he did not make the top 10. Now, before we get to number one, if you think I put someone up too high, put someone down too low, let me know what you think down here in the comments. Make sure you hit like, share, subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. With all that being said, our number one high flyer of all time, and you may have already guessed it just because of his omission on the list so far, Rey Mysterio Jr. Or just Rey Mysterio, depending on when you first knew of him. For over 30 years, or right around 30 years actually, Rey Mysterio has captivated and innovated pro wrestling. Whether it be his beret of moonsaults and Hunan Karanas, or turning the Tiger Feint kick from Tiger Mask into the 619, Rey is the guy that probably should not have made to where he made it. He's been a WWE champion. He's been a mainstay in WCW. He lit the world on fire in ECW. He was huge in Lucha Underground. He was huge in New Japan in the few moments he made it there. Rey Mysterio is an absolute legend. Bona fide first ballot Hall of Famer. Much like I said with everybody else on this list, you can look up and down this list, and everyone that came after Rey Mysterio, I almost blew it a few moments ago when I was talking about Red, because Red, to me, what I was going to say, Red was the new version of Rey Mysterio, which is huge. Guys like Rey Fenix right now get compared to Rey Mysterio just because of how much Rey Mysterio's style has influenced pro wrestling as a whole. He's a guy that's a main eventer all over the world. Any promotion you put him in, you take him out of WWE, you put him in AEW, he's a contender for their world title. You put him in Impact Wrestling, he's a contender for their world title. You put him in New Japan, he's a contender for their world title. And he's an absolute legend of all in wrestling. He's one of the greats of all time. And it's really astonishing knowing that this guy was able to carve out this much of an impact on pro wrestling when in the time that he started, it was jacked up muscle men that were the people that were the heroes. You know, he started in the era of the Lex Lugers, the Hulk Hogans, the Razor Ramones, the Kevin Nashes, guys that were all massively bigger than him. And he carved out his own niche, and he showed a different path. And in a lot of ways, he created the template for modern pro wrestling. Whether you like it or you don't like it, Rey, to me, is the greatest high flyer of all time. And that's my opinion. Now, again, like I said, if you think I put someone up too high, too low, left someone off altogether, let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you watched this far, I know you enjoyed my video. Usually I say one word to put down in the comments. Instead of doing that, let me know what your favorite high-flying move is, whether it be a moonsault, a Hurricanrana, 450. Let me know what your favorite high-flying move is down in the comments. I'd be interested to see what you guys think. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this is my top 10 high flyers in wrestling history.